We are live, ladies and gentlemen. I have a very exciting guest for you today. One of the fields of study that I just basically lit a fire of passion into my world is the social impact space and what blockchain can do with that. And we have today the head of social impact for Consensys. They've built products like Impactio. If you haven't checked them out, I will leave those links below. Robbie Greenfield, ladies and gentlemen. Robbie, how are you doing today?
I'm doing very well, and I greatly appreciate the opportunity to be on. Thank you so much, man.
It's my pleasure. You know, this sector is something that's really driven me to work really hard, something I didn't think I would want to do all that much, but I have a deep level of passion for the work that you guys are doing. And I think that, you know, there's all these talks of scams and the things that are going wrong and technical speeds of the blockchain that projects like Impactio get nowhere near enough awareness. So right from the get-go, give us a little bit of your background and tell us about Impactio.global.
Yeah, absolutely. So Robert Greenfield, go by Robbie. I've been at Consensys for almost 3 years now. And effectively when I came in, the blockchain for social impact movement hadn't really started yet. And a lot of, NGOs, social enterprises were just starting to wrap their mind around, what blockchain was, how they could use it, much like corporates were doing the same for supply chain. So effectively, we found this niche in employing emerging technology, much like others have with AI and machine learning, with blockchain, and seeing how can we use this to empower others, or at least operational processes that help make lives better. Impactio was one of the earliest forms of that. Along with our partner, the World Wildlife Fund, we were thinking about how can we minimize the time that we, and by we, I mean like NGOs, social impact practitioners, minimize the time that we take trying to find the best projects and maximize the time that we spend implementing them. Because oftentimes we, find a great donor and we, coordinate with them, see what type of impact they want to do. And by the end of the year, we've just started to find, organizations or projects that are doing the type of work that that person is interested in furthering, rather than helping those organizations expand, those pilots. So Impactio was born to assess, curate and fund sustainable projects around the world in a way that doesn't create, ultra dependency on just one organization. It takes that curation process and it decentralizes it across a curation, community that really cares about how these projects do, and a project leader community that really cares about implementing, great things.
Yeah, I think so often the blockchain sector overlooks the importance of understanding the social implications of this technology. You and I were talking before the show. People don't know how a plane works necessarily. Like, they generally can understand, I think, aerodynamics and that there's thrust involved. But the importance is that they can get from point A to point B faster, and they can visit more people, they can do more work. I think so often in the tech sector, people get focused on the underlying tech aspect instead of understanding, well, how does this make someone's life better, and how do we make the world a better place? And that those are the real drivers of selling a platform to someone, because then you've made my life easier, you've made it more convenient, you've made it maybe even better, and you've made my life more purpose-filled potentially. And I think things like Impactio are probably some of the first emergent ideas I've seen where there's a real potential to disrupt the charity sector. So can you tell us a little bit about the first campaigns that you guys did with the World Wildlife Fund as well as Panda Labs?
Yeah, absolutely. So we did kind of a litany of pilots with the World Wildlife Funds, first starting with an internal pilot just with their team to understand, how does this work? What things don't work with mainstream users? Mainly the usage of crypto wallets or extensions, any layer that is very obviously blockchain. Is most likely not going to work with layman users. So going through that first iteration, and then the live pilot, which we hosted this past summer with World Wildlife Fund, and obviously in Australian Ethical, which is like the main funder of the grants for the first pilot, went really well. We had hundreds of curation actions across a community of curators that were in the WWF. And not only that, but we had $30,000 worth of Impactio tokens that were contributed toward the projects that ended up winning. And some of these projects were ones that you wouldn't have normal visibility if they had gone through another process, because typically the grant process, much like any selection process, has a political accent to it, right? Where if I know somebody who is, the grant coordinator or the CEO of the NGO that's providing the grants, right, I'm going to have naturally a leg up regardless of the quality of my project. So I think it really showed that transparency from the project application stage to feedback to assessment, and then, actual funding, that you can have, a fair and distributed process of allowing, certain projects to grow wherever you are in the world. And it was, a multi-country process in terms of where these projects came from, and have that same ability to impact. So it was a great experience. We're moving into a new pilot with the New South Wales government and WWF Global, and trying to see more. How can we really expand the impact that Impactio is having?
Yeah, it's one of these spaces too where I don't think a lot of people necessarily recognize some of the underlying problems that the nonprofit or NGO sector has. There's a great talk by Dan Pallotta, who I sent you earlier, and
Yeah.
we really need to basically understand that the way we think about charity is kind of broken and dead. It was originally designed as a penance for people that were hardcore capitalists, and they wanted to
Yeah.
give back to the world because they had
Yeah.
made so much money doing maybe potentially questionable things. Where nowadays, the amount of companies that have gone to the $100 million range is like 50 or 60,000, but the amount of nonprofits that have done that is like 50.
Yeah.
And there's a direct break where we look at the charitable sector to run differently than we do the for-profit sector. And it's basically cut the legs off any good business when you're like, okay, well, you can only pay your CEO this much and you can only spend this much money on marketing and advertising. That will cut the legs off any good business, because you're basically saying that talent is considered overhead. And these are people that are very, very passionate about what they do. They're exceptionally gifted quite often, and that they could go get a job somewhere else for $10 million a year selling violent video games. So instead of sending all these brilliant people running to the for-profit sector, finding a way to really gamify and build something that it instills confidence in the people that have the technical capabilities to run a company, to do the marketing and advertising. Are there ways you guys are looking at overcoming some of the obstacles that the charity sector has inherently by being nonprofit and being, I guess just by being non-profitable?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it really starts with that funding and kind of pilot deployment process. So we're always very sensitive to the fact that, NGOs, social enterprises that, really lead the world in the methodology of how do you create sustainable impact, typically are always worrying about overhead. So usually we work with them not only to manage the curation process and using the platform, but also we typically try to find funding partners and can even, facilitate collaborative challenges, right? So I think the World Wildlife Fund, in terms of that first pilot, was the Future Cities Challenge. And this is one that, not just the WWF is vested in, but I think really, the entire city, the entire community, other organizations that operate, within that same region, are all dedicated toward, we understand that the way that we live, as a society isn't sustainable, and it benefits all of us, not just one organization, to be a part of this, curation process and find the best projects that can help us lead the way forward in terms of better living. So these are typically, devices, particularly the collaborative challenges, that we leverage in order, to kind of curb, right, the costs associated with it both. And also it makes grant dollars go further. And I think that's one thing that a lot of, including social impact venture capital firms, we've always heard that everyone kind of has their different way of assessing what impact is. And that there's not really a standardized way to understanding what truly does, change lives. And that's really unfortunate because it creates a lot of leaks, within our system, in which you can have projects that have, amazing, brand presence and marketing, but then you go on the ground and you're like, well, nothing's happening here. And then you can find another project that may be much, much smaller in scale, it's somewhere in a rural village, right? But it is having such a deep impact on that entire community, but they have almost no online presence. So I think that's the even ground that we're trying to have, is both enabling NGOs to collaborate together, right, and minimize the operational costs in terms of finding the best projects, but also enabling those grant dollars that go to those selected projects to go as far as they possibly can, regardless of where that project lead is from.
Yeah, the importance of other people's consciousness involved in these campaigns too is such I think a wildly overlooked idea. The nonprofit sector, because they can't always afford um, having high level players in their team, being able to incentivize the other people that have this information, whether it's their background skills, is such an important way to go, and really gamifying the experience is a way to bring those other people on board. For those of you that are in the community that have ever heard of Jeff Lawton or John D. Liu, these are two guys that do permaculture and agricultural rebuilds for different areas in the world. They've taken places where there was no more water and been able to bring back the water reserves. And these guys basically just run around as like freelancers, trying to get governments to pick up and give them grants to basically do agriculture. So to find ways to get, because they're not a part of a specific nonprofit, they do their own thing because it's more profitable for them to do that, to be freelancers, but to be able to find a way to get all these different people to collaborate together on projects or campaigns that may not have normally worked together before is it's a really inspiring thing for me. Anyone that's part of the Arcane Bear knows that I've been spending a massive amount of time building Rivers of the Sky. It's my main focus is in the social impact space. So when I saw what Robbie and the Consensys team put together with Impactio, I was like, oh man, this is Impactio. I was like, this is like our jam.
Yeah.
Can you tell us what you see over the next year for Impactio and how you guys plan on developing, growing, and maybe trying to reach out for further collaborations?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, first and foremost is making sure that it's trial and tested. So even though we've had, previous pilots in the past, now we really want to, work with really anyone. It's not just any NGOs or social enterprises, but, organizations to see, okay, how can we take this curation process to the next level? Because in addition to the curation process itself, right, getting, finding those projects and, and funding them, that simple process, we do want to create a lot of engagement around that. And we do want to see what other benefits, to other players within this, process, within this engagement can really benefit by being a part of it. And I think that, finding really those stories, right? That project, in, rural India or in the Philippines, right? That would have never, ever, had the visibility had they not, had the chance to go through this process. And then seeing what they do after they're funded, I think is one of the stories, that we were really seeking in this, new year, as we've seen in some of our smaller pilots. So, all in all, really just collaborating. There are a lot of iterations that we want to bring to Impactio, outside of the curation process, like the funding transparency process. So, allowing, grant providers to understand what are those secondary transactions after I give that grant money to make sure that no one's committing fraud or that, they're really spending their money efficiently. And, on the same token, making sure that, some of the intangible features, outside of transparency and blockchain related things are also tended to as well. And I think, you and your team have, are leading the pack in that. And we've discussed, ideas around that. So, overall, I think 2020 is a year of collaboration and piloting and just iteration, between those two things.
So, sorry, I muted myself there. The importance of collaboration is such, I think it's commonly overlooked because people get closed off like, okay, well, we want to be in control of how this goes. And, you know, if I give my ideas away to other people, then they're going to be able to take advantage of the thoughts that I'm giving them. And we're in a time right now where we really don't have time to be competitive.
Yeah. Yeah.
Earlier, you and I were talking about, I mean, competition is good, but I think it's about how we frame it. You know, earlier we were talking, and I said something about like companies battling, and I very quickly retracted my statement. It's like, okay, companies want to outpace one another, and I think we're in a time right now where, consciously speaking, we need to really frame our dialogue differently so that we get rid of some of these more violent attributes that we found in the world of capitalism before, like, oh, we're going to stop the competition. It's like, well, how about we just like do a better job and lead by example instead of
Yeah.
just,
Yeah.
and come
Yeah.
up with nicer, kinder ways to say these things. And I think that these sectors specifically require like a higher level of conscious thought that goes into even curating the way we communicate about competitive behavior in our niche, because we're at a time right now where, you know, um, regardless of what happens to us from here on out, the world, like the society, deserves better from us in the work that we do. And it starts with, you know, some of the ways we communicate with one another and the way we communicate in our business sector at large. And this stuff I think often goes overlooked, but being in the social impact space, you know, the what do you want to call it, conscious capitalism or right livelihood, there's a number of ways to talk about it, but it's the idea that the products that we're building, or the products that you guys are building and that we're building, is designed to be good for other people. It's designed to make my life better and the world a better place. And that when you hold banner flags like this, it's important to be like, to really take, to almost start over from how capitalism was run, and take a new look at that. And so with, even though there's a competitive nature to any business, we're definitely in a time where we need collaborative, more like a supportive behavior, even from the way we communicate about business. So I'm really excited about the potential that Impactio has. Can you tell us about, I noticed you guys have been doing some other impacts stuff outside of Impactio. Can you tell us a little bit about this as well?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, 2019 has been, I think the social sector is starting to, pivot from, pilot to scale. And it's very interesting to see different organizations find, okay, what is my niche when it comes to emerging technology? And on the same token, I think a lot of NGOs and social enterprises are starting to understand where the place for technology in general is on their team, right? We're leaving, a time in which, and you see this a lot in the public sector as well, where, using like mostly Excel for most things, like 1990s tools, right? And I think a lot of these organizations that are having, a daily impact on a lot of people's lives around the world are starting to realize, okay, we may need to have a more diversified team to approach some of these problems that are persistently, affecting, our communities. So a few pilots that we've done, this year and in years past, one notable one also with the Consensys Australia team is our project Unblock Cash. And that is with Oxfam, Vanuatu specifically. And we partnered with two organizations, so Oxfam, and then also an organization called SEMPO. And effectively, it was a cash assistance pilot. So for those who aren't familiar with cash assistance, a lot of organizations within the social sector are starting to pivot from providing material goods to people to providing just cash. And the reason is because a perfect example, for the Syrian refugee crisis, almost 70% of the goods provided to Syrian refugees was sold for something else. And it really goes against this Western assumption that we know what people need around the world when a crisis happens, because there are a lot of cultural obstacles to what need it actually is and how that's defined depending on what's going on. So organizations are starting to transition to, no, let's just enable, and empower these communities to be able to purchase what they need on the ground when these things happen. And the Project Unblock Cash pilot was actually the first digitized cash pilot in the world. So effectively, it used cryptocurrency in a way in which the user wasn't even aware. They were given an NFC card. They just simply went to their vendor, just like you or I would use a debit card and go to our vendors, and they were able to purchase goods in a very effortless way. and in a way that complete visibility as to how those programs funds were used. So you could take fraud from what would be 10 to 20% typically in a cash disbursement program to virtually 0%, and it could only be used with the participating vendors. So it was a great success. We also have a video on that on YouTube for anyone interested. But also, I think what differentiated that particular pilot is that there was a considerable amount of cultural research and methodology that was hand in hand with the technology, and really the technology was just the backbone of a solution that wasn't at all apparent to those who are participating, which is how it should be. Blockchain is a back end tool, just like your plane example earlier. When you fly a plane, you don't know how to build it. When you're using Facebook, you don't know the database structure that they use, for good or for bad, in terms of determining what you like. And just like using Simpo, which was the main tool in this particular pilot, you don't know the code behind it, which is how things should work. In addition, we're doing work with the U.S. State Department at Harvard and the Levi's Foundation for Worker Wellness, and this is around this use case of immutable evidence. So understanding that grievance reporting in the many factories that make our shirts, make our goods, that those people who are in those factories are being treated well, and that when they do report about something, that isn't being tampered with. And we've seen a very similar use case that we did last year with Hala Systems in Syria for war crimes as well. So you're also starting to see these pilots of identity, of cash aid, of curation with Impactio, but also with immutable evidence, in terms of these are some core ways that blockchain technology can simply and effectively help people in need.
There's something really interesting you touched on there. So I had some really big visions about what this looks like over the next 20 years. And one of the first ones I had, we were talking about this earlier, was the gamification of the entire giving experience. And when I saw, just as you had mentioned, instead of bringing the people what we think they need, we give them the tools to basically jumpstart their economy again. And so by bringing them the vendors and the tools and the materials that they might need, you're providing them the ability to create an economy within side of whatever we give them. And that way, it probably, like you said, not only does it decrease fraud because they can only function with the vendors that are there, it also decreases waste because they're going to choose what it is that they think that they need the most, and probably from there be able to build a much better version of their functioning economy. And when I saw this gamification and of rebuilding the charitable sector, I didn't see us bringing them stuff. I saw us giving them the tools to jumpstart their economy, as you said, like digitally native apps that they didn't necessarily notice were blockchain underneath, and then bringing them the vendors to be able to be like, well, do you want to buy saws? Do you want to buy materials to build houses? And really connecting this basically underserved, or not underserved, but this disaster potential community with the companies and brands, whether they're for building tents or whatever it might be. It gave them the opportunity to feel more empowered instead of like they were just being given stuff. They could, because they were going through the process of actually curating their own storyline, it was much more empowering to the economic potential of what we could see with tracking the cash itself, seeing how they spend it, where are they. It gives us much more data to work with too, in terms of the impact that can be made. So I really like that you guys went down that route, because it's something that I had noticed right away in my visions, was that the best way to do this isn't to give them stuff, it's to give them an economy and let them empower themselves through the tools that they're given, instead of like, oh, someone built me a house. It's like, well, how about we give them the tools to build a house instead? Because then they'll take ownership for what they're actually putting together.
Yeah, and you see time and time again that that's the most effective way. And I think finally we're starting to see the dampening of this kind of, typically Western-centric model of aid in general, and that you can't just go somewhere and say, this is how things are going to be done. That typically doesn't work very well, for good reason, right? Because if for a demo reverse, I'm sure it wouldn't work well, in our society is, either. But to your point, right? You give the tools, you give the education, but you also make sure to the best of your ability. And this is where, storytellers like yourself, on the marketing side, but also product designers are so crucial to the engineering process. And a lot of people don't know this. They see blockchain technology as something that's just engineering only. It would not take off at all. It wouldn't even, be a thing if it weren't for the storytellers and for the designers, because you have to embed the cultural context within the tools that you're providing somebody in order for them to work. Otherwise, they're worthless. And to your point, right? Those are those tools that allow, that thing to be used for years and years to come, rather than you just have a pilot. And then once the pilot ends, everything ends.
Yeah, the longevity of this stuff is almost counterintuitive, because we would think that, we give them the money, or we give them the stuff, and then whatever happened there is done. Whereas
Yeah.
when you go in and you give them the tools here, they're the potential for them to rebuild their own society, to maybe even turn what was once so you said an NFC card. How are the here's a question for the Vanuatu campaign. How are the tokens created? Was it from a funding mechanism into the tokens prior? And were they like NFTs, or were they tokens that were separate on the Ethereum blockchain based off how much was funded?
Yeah. So in terms of the back end, it was done on Ethereum mainnet, so the main Ethereum blockchain. And in terms of the value, the store of value was actually DAI. And DAI served as kind of a reserve for the local currency in Vanuatu. So effectively, any transaction that was used with the NFC cards, with the vendors, would calculate, at least to the user, as just a normal transaction using their normal local currency, whereas that store of value is actually the stable coin DAI. And then afterwards, when all the vendors had finished out their transactions, we had a super vendor, that would effectively provide an immediate reimbursement and transition that DAI back into the local cash, so that they could actually take their revenue and do as they wish. So. And that's a process that we're continuing, to iterate on, making sure that we have financial institutions involved, and making sure, again, that you are compliant with the laws around, cryptocurrencies and such, so that you can make it as frictionless, as a transaction as possible, not only for the end user, but also for the participating vendors who have allowed us, right, to come into their communities, work with excellent partners like Oxfam Vanuatu, and see, what are the limitations to this particular process. And, I have to give, major credit to, the Sempo team, another, organization that I think, really doesn't give as much credit, as they deserve. I mean, they've done other pilots in Turkey and Syria and Greece. And I think, the work, that we did with them in Vanuatu is really showing the maturity of their product, especially on the design part.
Yeah, you've made a great point there about the storyteller aspect. The digitally native society is almost entirely about storytelling. It is important that people understand the emotional aspects of the difference that this makes for the people on the ground. And unless you can share that, it just goes totally unnoticed. Like there's a prime example. I think Ripple gave the Ripple Foundation gave like some $20 million to a charity last year, and they won some awards in the charity sector for doing so. But I never heard anything about it. The only reason I knew about it is because I've spent like a lot of time trying to understand what's going on in the social impact space in the blockchain sector. Yet nothing on Cointelegraph, nothing on Bitcoin.com, nothing on any of the other normal channels. None of the content creators knew anything about it. And it's this, there's still that big disconnect of how do we get these stories and how do we tell them properly, because otherwise it's almost like a waste. Like, it's obviously not a waste. It made a difference for the people that were on the ground, but in terms of, the blockchain sector, or distributed ledger technology, however you want to look at it, getting a better name for itself and building trust as a whole, we need people out there sharing these stories. Otherwise, it goes upon dead ears, and there's crickets, and everyone's talking about BitConnect or some friggin' hex coin.
Yeah.
There's all this other cool shit happening.
Yeah, no, I completely agree, and it's one, for those who know me best, it's one of the polarizing, thoughts that I've had is that it's really interesting to see, how philosophical the blockchain ecosystem as a whole has always been, right? In terms of the ethos, right? Particularly on, decentralization and fairness and disintermediating power centers, I don't think is necessarily carrying through with these initial products, that we're seeing come from the space. And because we've, abandoned, I think, that initial mission statement, for what is maybe more commercially viable, or operationalizing certain commercial processes, because that's what venture capitalists are going to provide backing for, more so than developing the new and sustainable social enterprises. I think we're creating this false dichotomy between creating great social impact and having a good return on investment as a business, for those businesses that want to operate in the ecosystem, when really, to your point, if you have a great story to tell that naturally fits the product or service that you're trying to create using this technology, and you can use many other technologies as well and have the same impact, that's going to go much further, right? Because people will actually care about what you're doing, regardless if they're going to consume it or not. Whereas, certain pilots, to your point, things like, use cases like BitConnect, or, some of the things, that you see on, blockchain, news outlets, I don't think connect with the heart as much. And certainly don't communicate to that, initial ethos. And the main reason why a lot of people came into the blockchain space initially, right? Because they felt in some way the oppression of being a part of a system that was unfair. Particularly, in contrast to those who, very obviously live in unfair systems abroad. If you're, someone like me who's American, right, where you can talk, a little bit, but not too much, right? And in contrast to a lot of other areas that are a lot worse off.
Yeah, there's a great point there too, that in some way, shape, or form, some of it is probably coming from the fact that a fair amount of the Western societies still have everything going. Everything's been like fine and dandy for a long time. So there's a big disconnect between the way things are in like a good chunk of the rest of the world. You've got 4 billion people that don't have access to internet or a bank card necessarily. You've got disaster relief areas that go untouched because there's, the Red Cross is extremely slow to move. And we just don't see those things because the stories don't get told. And when we don't share those stories, it's almost irrelevant, because you need the whole world kind of focusing together. And it's, people clamor together over things like climate change. It's like, well, you need to be focusing on one actionable step at a time. It's like, well, how about we reforest a few 100,000 hectares of land, or, rebuild ecosystems? Let's not just talk about the problems. Let's work on building definable solutions. And there's the real opportunity with the technology and the social storytelling to make a big difference. So I'm super excited to see the work that you guys have done in the area. The Vanuatu Cache is fantastic too, because it really hits home for some of the stuff that I had seen. Is there anything else that you guys have been working on with the social impact team that we might see over 2020, aside from the changes in Impactio? Oh.
Yeah, absolutely. So, we do have a few, and I'll keep the partner names out, because everything is not set in stone. But we are doing a lot of things with regards to rugged identity. So at the beginning of, I think, this kind of blockchain for social impact kind of theme, I wouldn't quite call it a revolution yet, but beginnings of one. Identity was a huge focal point. Self-sovereign identity, the ability to take, what has been, for the most part, government run, right? And certainly corporate run, right? If you're talking about the West, by organizations like, Facebook and Google, and taking that, that identity and all the data that it comes with it, and being able to assign ownership to the person itself, right, to the person who owns that identity. And this, in the West is maybe not as important now, because to your point, things are relatively convenient. We use great services like Facebook and Google because they come with a lot of great features, right? It's not necessarily all bad, though there is a fringe or an edge, right, when it comes to the actual security and privacy features of those things. But when you talk about, we go back to, Syrian refugee cases, or just refugee crises in general, you're talking about people who typically don't have any type of documentation, right? When they go into another nation, they can't access basic, services, provided by that government, provided by any financial institutions of that government. And it creates an almost impossible obstacle of reestablishing yourself because you were unknown. And this is kind of where self-sovereign identity and digital identity, from blockchain, was all the rage, right, across a lot of social sectors. But a lot of NGOs have found it very, very difficult to necessarily use, right, if that person doesn't know how that data is being used. But also implementable, right? In some areas, there is very low level of connectivity. There's very low level of literacy, right? So you can't just assume that someone has a smartphone or an iPhone. They're like, oh yeah, just show me your iPhone, with your passport on it, and you can, go on your way. So you kind of have these technical and design obstacles and constraints from both sides. People have been struggling with. And in 2020, hopefully, if everything goes well, it's a lot more rugged, but bring someone who, is illiterate, who, lives in a low connectivity area, but who can still leverage their digital identity in a way that allows them access to, programmatic services, whether facilitated by an NGO agency or facilitated by their respective government or government abroad.
Yeah. Oh, that's brilliant. I mean, I can't imagine having gone through a disaster and losing your birth certificate or any of your identification, and trying to basically rebuild your identity would be next to impossible, if not like impossible unto itself. It's just something, yeah, again, because we live in a fairly comfortable society, there's some type of backup, or we've stored it somewhere safe. But if you were to lose all that, it would be next to impossible to try to get to be like, no, this is who I am. And for your government to believe you, or for other governments to believe you, like the limits on travel, bank accounts, anything would just be instantly taken off the table. It's such a an interesting topic, because we live in a fairly comfortable society. It's just something we never really take into account. Well, Robert, this has been fantastic. I know we're rolling up on an hour. I want to congratulate everyone who's made it this far in the conversation. I know I'm really grateful for the chat today. I think what you guys are doing is fantastic. I think that this is going to be one of the lead developments of these sectors that really bring widespread awareness and adoption into the mainstream, because a lot of people, if you can, to connect with them somewhere where they're, deeply passionate about, whether it's, doing good for nature or doing good for other people, then you've got a rocket ship on your hands, because most people don't care about the tech. They don't care how many transactions per second the blockchain can make. They care about seeing the difference that it makes in their world, and the difference that it makes in the world that they live in. And I think that's something that will really put blockchain and I guess distributed ledger technology on the map. And from there, people will actually care about this sector, instead of just trying to make money off of it, get rich quick scams and all this nonsense that we see almost as a prevailing or at least a dominant part of the sector at this particular time.
Yeah, Tijo, you and your team have been great, and I really, really do appreciate the opportunity, and certainly, obviously, we've talked about collaborating more, and I completely agree with you, right? It's the stories that are going to lead people to adopting the technology, right? People use Facebook because they wanted to connect with one another, right? They use Google because they want to learn more, right? They don't use these tools, because they want to understand the code more. They want to use data science practices to find out more insights, right? And I think this blockchain is going through the same maturity, right? It's only barely, not even a teenager yet. So it's in its infancy, and I'm really looking forward to seeing more use cases that have a story to tell, so that it can really accomplish that initial ethos and mission statement that encourage everybody to come in and join within the ecosystem. So hopefully we'll see more of that, and Impactio team, with Claudio and, Alex and, everyone in Australia as well. We're certainly trying to accomplish that.
Yeah, I think you guys are well on your way to putting something very, very useful and functional together here. So I'm glad we were able to have this chat. Remember, ladies and gentlemen, if you like this content, give us the thumbs up. Leave your thoughts, your questions, your comments down below. All of the links for Impactio, the Vanuatu campaigns, those will also be down in the description if you want as well. I believe you can still sign up for Impactio.global using either your LinkedIn, your Facebook. You can scroll around and take a look at some of the previous challenges that were on there if you guys are interested. Remember also to share this content, because it's one of the best ways to get YouTube's algorithm to like what we're doing and bring this message to as many people as humanly possible. Robbie, one last time, thank you again so much for your time today. I'll keep you on for another few minutes afterwards, and hopefully we'll see you again soon.
Thanks.